if we look back to 1986, we had just over 300 hectares of land, 330 hectares of land dedicated to industrial use. Fast forward to where we are today, to 2019, we have over 80,000 hectares of land throughout the country that is now dedicated for industrial use and for industrial zones. So this growth has been phenomenal over the last 30 years, and really over the last 10 years, it's picked up a lot of pace. We've seen this growth over this, the past 3 decades that's steadily been building up, but it's really been supported by government initiatives, by free trade agreements, by creation of economic zones. And this has really helped to generate a lot of interest and a lot of companies moving into Vietnam to set up operations here. So it's a very positive and optimistic growth story. And in 2019, we expect the industrial sector to be the spotlight sector in all real estate in 2019. So the e-commerce market is still relatively new in Vietnam, but what we have is very key fundamental conditions for the e-commerce sector. So we have a very young demographic, a very young population, a very tech-savvy population. So the smartphone penetration rate in Vietnam is over 90% now. Good access to the internet, a lot of people using their smartphones to order online. So we've seen, I think in 2017, that the numbers are relatively small, still maybe about under $2 billion of purchases online. But the speed of growth is one of the fastest in the region. So over 25% per annum growth year on year over the last 3 or 4 years. So what is the impact of that? And that the impact on the real estate side means that people need to deliver goods. They need to deliver goods and they need to deliver them very, very quickly. So when you order online, you expect your goods to be delivered within the same day or maybe the next day. So very quick delivery. This expectation means that we need more logistics and more warehousing to store those goods, certainly within the last mile. So the last mile delivery is very, very important. So a lot of occupiers, a lot of investors and a lot of developers are now looking at logistics and warehousing in and around the major cities so they can service people very, very quickly. The reason that companies are moving to Vietnam are for 3 or 4 key reasons. The first reason is free trade agreements. So there are now 26 free trade agreements that have either been signed off or are in detailed negotiations. So free trade agreements help the movement of goods and they reduce the tariffs. So they act as a level playing field. So it's much easier for companies to operate in Vietnam when there's the tariffs have been removed. Then we have economic zones, so industrial economic zones that have been set up. So again, we see favorable business environment being set up for businesses. So reduction in incentives and tax incentives, and also just a favorable business environment. So that, together with free trade agreements, is acting as a catalyst to bring more investment into the country. One of the key disadvantages for Vietnam in the future will be accessibility to labor. So trying to cope with the amount of demand that we're now seeing for industrial, we're now hearing that there's limited labor supply. So this could be, one of the disadvantages for Vietnam in the future, and we really need to think about more education and how we can create more labor in the future. So the infrastructure is probably one of the key drivers of growth in all real estate sectors, but in industrial in particular. So we've seen the infrastructure in some of the more traditional industrial areas coming under a lot of pressure. So a lot of lorries and a lot of transport going in and out of these industrial zones. As we see these industrial zones establish themselves, so they become at full capacity, obviously the amount of traffic increases and that creates more pressure on the infrastructure. We're starting to see in Vignung and some of the more established areas, so you have VSIP1, you now have VSIP2, so an extension of those industrial areas is now happening. Again, it's creating more and more pressure. So continued investment in infrastructure is key. And I think if you look at Vietnam on a regional basis, the amount of spending on infrastructure is actually fairly high when you compare it to other Southeast Asian. But spending more money on infrastructure is maybe not just the solution. So as we're all aware, Industry 4.0 is very much in vogue at the moment, and everyone's talking about Industry 4.0. And what it means is basically automation and how we can use automation to help with the efficiency of the industrial sector. So over time, we're going to start to see more and more automation, or the use of automation to help with the efficiency of movement of goods. And this may help to some extent the pressure on infrastructure. So Industry 4.0 is sort of very critical to the key to making more efficiency in industry over time. As the industrial parks become established and they start to fill up, and you start to get companies operating in the parks, what that does is creates, obviously there's a lot of people that go and work in the parks. And then you start to see residential development, retail development, and the associated development of other real estate sectors around the park. What are we predicting for the industrial sector over the next 5 to 10 years? I think, first and foremost, the industrial sector in Vietnam is probably the most active and the most positive sector at this moment. The reasons being that, first and foremost, the government is establishing Vietnam as this export-driven economy. So, and as I mentioned, free trade agreements, economic zones, access to relatively cheap labor, and a strategic location on a global basis, so access to shipping lanes and movement of goods are all very important aspects of why Vietnam stands out as a sort of a manufacturing hub for Southeast Asia. We expect the industrial sector to be very, very active over the next 5 to 10 years. If we look at more established markets in the region, such as we can look at China, Korea, even Indonesia and Thailand, these markets have established themselves and are probably 5 to 10 years ahead of Vietnam. So we look at those markets as a benchmark. So we can see the amount of growth that is going to happen in Vietnam, and we're still in the very early infancy stages of the industrial market. So there is huge potential for this sector, and we expect that to continue over the next